Welcome back to our little video series. Today I wanted to talk about Jesus' teaching on eunuchs in the Bible and why that matters to us as a transgender people, or to anybody who feels excluded by religion and the religious. What I've tried to do in the past couple of videos is give some context and background history about eunuchs in the Bible and in history, in which to create a context really for Jesus' teaching, because it's not an obvious and easy teaching to understand without the background. So in Matthew 19, Matthew records in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus teaches about eunuchs, and it's a really interesting little story. It's a great one to open up. What happened was that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the experts in the law, came to Jesus because again they wanted to trip him up. They wanted to find some excuse against him, to denounce him, to expose him as a heretic, as a fraud. So they tried to trick him with a teaching on divorce. But Jesus, rather than being the victim in the dialogue, turns the whole situation around. And what we have here is we have a group of Pharisees, religious leaders, experts in the law, and then we have the disciples who are involved in the dialogue. So we know it's in a public place, so there may well have been a crowd. And when Jesus explains marriage and divorce, the disciples say to him, well, if marriage is that difficult, then what is the point in getting married? And Jesus' response is really almost bizarre, because he takes as his subject something which is so offensive to the Pharisees, to the legalists, to those who abided, the strict Jews who abided by the purity laws. He takes the person of the eunuch as his illustration, and it is so offensive, so explosive. It is the sort of dialogue that was typical, the sort of dialogue that could have easily got Jesus stoned or crucified. And so Jesus says, this is a hard teaching. For those who can accept it, then do. And he says, some are born eunuchs, some are made eunuchs by others, and some choose to live as eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And in our modern age, it's not easy to understand this teaching. When Jesus is talking about those born eunuchs, clearly and obviously there are those who are born intersex, there are those who are born who are impotent, who cannot have children because they're born with various intersex conditions. But also within that umbrella, that understanding was very much the understanding that those who were asexual, or those who today we would call homosexual, who had no natural desire for women, would be included in the term eunuch. One of the reasons for that is because they had no natural desire for women. They would be very useful to the dynasties, to the work of looking after the king's harem and his concubines and his entourage. And as I explained before, the dynasties and the kings of the kingdoms of Assyria, Babylon, Persia and Greece, they kept their dynasties safe, not just by waging war and military might, but as much they kept their kingdoms safe through marriage. So we not only need to understand the eunuch to understand Jesus' teaching, we need to understand the harem and the concubines within these dynasties. And even if you go as late as the 16th and 17th century in the Mughal empires in India, you have a really clear picture of how the harem was structured. And some of these harems could have as many as 1,000 women in them. And they wouldn't all be concubines. They wouldn't just be the king's concubines, his loves, but that would include the queen's mother, his sisters, his wider family. The king's mother would be, if you like, the matriarch over the harem. And then you would have all the women who looked after them, and the eunuchs who looked after them. So the harem could be a huge operation to look after. The power of the eunuchs was in that because they were impotent, because they couldn't have children, couldn't conceive children, they weren't considered a threat to the king's dynasty. And so they were able to work in the harem, they were able to serve the women, to serve the king's mother, to serve his concubines, as we see even in the book of Esther. So you start to realise that actually the eunuchs are controlling much of the family life, much of the contact, and who can come in and who can come out. And no other men were allowed into the harem except the king. And the people who controlled access would be the eunuchs. And so you see the confidence and the trust and the relationship between the eunuch and the king was implicit. It was total. And their fidelity, their faithfulness to the king. There are records of eunuchs having affairs with concubines and being executed for it. So there obviously was relationships that went on illegally, illicitly. But generally, the eunuchs served the interest of the king above their own. So that's a little bit of context when Jesus is talking about those who are made eunuchs by others. But then he says the most incredible thing. He says some choose to live as eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And here what he's doing is he's exalting the eunuch in terms of holiness, in terms of righteous living, in a way that would have been so offensive to the religious, to the Pharisees, to the religious experts, the teachers of the law, that even the priests, because he's taking someone who is unclean, rejected, defiled, and unwelcome in God's people, and is elevating them to a position of prominence as an example of righteousness and holiness. And we can't even begin to get our heads around how offensive that was, and it is, that Jesus was breaking purity laws. He was advocating the sweeping aside of purity law to welcome in the eunuch. And the way I have come to understand this little story is if you imagine the scene as Jesus was teaching, and you have the Pharisees and the religious leaders and the priests, you have the disciples, and probably a crowd. Can you imagine if in that crowd, hiding in fear, there is a eunuch? The eunuch who's not allowed into the assembly of God's people, hiding at the back of the crowd for fear of the Pharisees, for fear of the religious, for fear of mockery and rejection. Because they are a despised character. And all of a sudden, Jesus motions for the crowd to separate, for the disciples to move out of the way, and welcomes the eunuch in to come and sit at his side. When you picture that in your mind's eye, when you imagine that, of Jesus' inclusion of the eunuch, you realise why the religious wanted to crucify him, why his teaching was so offensive. Because here, demonstrated more clearly than almost anywhere else in Jesus' life and ministry, he's demonstrating such a radical inclusion of those who the law has excluded and shut out. It's a mind-blowing little story. And orthodox, traditional patriarchal Christianity has always taught this passage as being about celibacy, but it misses, in making this passage teaching all about celibacy, it totally misses many beautiful points that need drawing out. So the first point I conclude from Jesus' teaching is not just in the teaching itself, but it is in a radical inclusion of the eunuch as a holy person, as an example of righteousness, rather than being the eunuch who was forbidden from ever entering into God, the presence of God's people. And even when we remember the passage in Isaiah, where Isaiah speaks God's heart for the eunuch and says to the eunuch, why do you complain that you're a barren tree, that you can have no children? I will give you a name in my temple greater than that of sons and daughters, greater than that of male and female even. I will give you a name in my temple for everlasting, God says to the eunuch. And even though Isaiah had spoken that out, even in Jesus' day, in the temple, in the new temple that had been built in Jerusalem, the eunuch was still not allowed in to the temple. He could only enter the outer court, so the eunuchs were still excluded. So here Jesus is going one step further and is saying to the eunuchs, welcome, I accept you, I affirm you. For me that's beautiful. But then the next thing that I would draw from Jesus' teaching on eunuchs is actually the beautiful intimacy that the eunuch has in the relationship with the king. That the eunuch has the ear of the king, the eunuch has the king's heart, his confidence, knows his affairs, that the king is dependent upon the eunuch for his safety, and the eunuch is dependent upon the king for his safety. So there's a beautiful relationship between the eunuch and the king, which, when you reduce this passage to just being about celibacy, it reduces the gospel to almost a matter of policing and controlling people's identity rather than setting people free. So that's just two small elements that I see from looking at Jesus' teaching on eunuchs. And bringing it into today's context, it exposes those religious people who want to shut out and exclude others for being transgender or gay. It exposes the religious hypocrisy of that in such a lovely, gentle and beautiful way. So I'm not even going to begin to talk about how Jesus' teaching then could be interpreted to be about celibacy, because clearly from history we know that the eunuchs weren't celibate. They were impotent, but they weren't necessarily celibate. And we know that eunuchs rose to such power that they governed whole districts, and they were given homes and slaves and servants, and some of them took wives. So clearly it can't be just about celibacy. But you only find that out when you do the research, when you study history. So I'm just putting that on the table, something to think about, something to talk about, something to expand our vision of Scripture. And then I think probably what I'll do is conclude with the story of the Ethiopian eunuch on the road to Samaria, and what happens there and what that means for us and for us as transgender. I hope that's been helpful, interesting, and thank you for tuning in. Lots and lots of love, and see you next week.